Hey, this is Steve Guttenberg, and I'm sitting with a legend, Dan D'Agostino. Dan and I go way back. I knew him, I think I met you like in 1985 or so,
Yeah,
or
something
maybe
like that.
earlier
Maybe
than that.
earlier, maybe
Yeah,
83 or something.
yeah.
Yeah,
I had a KSA 100
right.
that I bought from you,
Yeah,
and it was a magical time.
yeah. That was a fun time in audio, I have to say.
It was, yeah. But in thinking about what we were going to talk about today, I was thinking about measurements because I'm sort of an anti-measurement guy.
Yeah,
So I'm thinking, I'm not saying measurements are bad for engineers. I'm saying measurements can be misunderstood by consumers, and used in reviews. Oh, look, it has this, it has that. But from an engineer's point of view, what measurements are useful to you in terms of basically predicting how something's going to sound, an amplifier is going to sound? I think that's like my big question.
well, I think that's a really hard entity to define. I mean, I used, distortion measurement equipment and FFT stuff and all that kind of equipment to ascertain if my equipment's working the way I anticipate it is.
Right.
But I found when I started this company, as opposed to when I was at Krell I was looking for the best distortion, the best
Mm-hmm.
speed, the best slew rate, the best, and I did that stuff. But it never, I shouldn't say never, but it always did not equate. The best measurement device rarely, if ever, sounded the best thing that I've ever designed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the best sounding amplifiers I've ever made was at KSA 50.
Yeah.
And that amplifier on its own with relatively modest distortion figures, 0.1, 0.2%, sounded very musical.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pursuit. And when I changed seats and I left Krell and I started Dan D'Agostino Master Audio, I wanted to get back that thrill, that goosebump generating device that the 50 was.
Right.
And so I set about doing listening tests and distortion tests that I found that you could make a very musical sounding amplifier with, by today's standards, relatively high distortion.
Interesting.
0.4, 0.5, 1%.
Really?
And,
Wow.
and it defies your ear to hear that. You really hear the music. And oftentimes, by not using feedback, which I'm very fond of doing, I don't like feedback as a tool. I mean, it's a very good tool to use discriminately.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a Band-Aid. And if you use it as a Band-Aid, it's a very terrible thing sonically.
Mm-hmm.
But an amplifier that's stable and runs a wide open loop and has very good sonic characteristics doesn't necessarily have to have really good distortion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my momentum amplifiers generally are 0.1%
Mm-hmm.
At full power, and that at Krell days I wouldn't even allowed that to be on the market.
Interesting. Wow.
Yeah, that never would have happened, and I find myself really really twisted when I did Dan D'Agostino. I really worked on the sound part. I didn't work on I worked on a circuit that I could work with.
Uh-huh.
I made a circuit that was easy to adjust and easy to change so I could listen to the different entities sonically. Because I went on the quest for the ultimate goosebump amplifier when I designed the momentum.
Uh-huh.
And I found out that THD was a wonderful tool to see that you were in the ballpark,
Uh-huh.
but really low THD measurements meant nothing to the sound, other than sometimes when you have very low THD measurements, you have very terrible sound, and vice versa. I mean, it's very possible to have high THD and have good sound.
But what about second harmonic distortion?
Those things have been a mystery and a witch hunt for me many, many times. I do know that having high second, low third, and then not much after that always sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
And high third and low second also sounds really good.
Uh-huh.
But as long as you don't have a lot of distortion after products like seventh and ninth,
Okay.
yeah, those things generally detract from sound.
Okay.
But that's not a guaranteed rule.
Mm-hmm.
I did have something I designed that I designed that had a lot of that and actually sounded pretty good.
Uh-huh.
And then it wasn't easy to pick up. I mean, a very overrated measurement from the 80s was slew rate.
Right.
I mean, God, you can't hear that. I mean, you can't hear it. Oh, 250 volts per microsecond. You can't hear it. I mean, it's way faster than music, and certainly way faster than any media you're using.
Wow.
And, slower amplifiers didn't sound worse than faster ones. I mean, a lot of people attribute fast amplifiers to kind of a little forward and a little bright sound, but that's not what a fast amplifier sounds like. A really, truly fast amplifier sounds musical and smooth.
Nice.
But sometimes a slow amplifier sounds kind of hard.
Really?
Yeah.
So you got to use your ears.
You have to use yours. I use my ears a lot at D'Agostino. I'm back to when I was a designer at Krell in the early 80s, when I first started putting products out on the market. And I found that the music part was missing from me at the end of my career at Krell. I was just designing really cool circuits and really stuff that was really off the chart. And but I wasn't listening a lot. And then when I started this company, Dan D'Agostino, I really worked at sound. I went to dealers, I went to people's homes and listened to their music and their speakers and their sound systems. And I tried to get back to that. And the fact is that the first momentum amplifier that I listened to after I got it off the perf board and put it in a box was that kind of thrill you get when you listen to the old recordings that you've listened to listened to, and you get that little bit of goosebumps on your hair, and sometimes you get tears in your eyes because you have a memory of the way something sounded way back when. And it was a really wonderful experience. And now I listen extensively to everything I produce before it even becomes a product.
Okay.
So, I mean, Relentless was a 2-year pursuit to make something that I've always wanted to do. And once I got it working, I was really concerned when I brought it home and I compared it to my Momentums that it wasn't going to sound as good. I mean, because it was a huge effort.
Wow.
But it did, and it did sound really good. And it measures better than a Momentum, but only because of that true mirror image balanced circuitry that it has. And that made a big difference in its measurement. But the basic amplifier itself kind of measures like a Momentum until you put the two halves together.
And that's the thing. That's what makes it sound better.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm kind of like you, Steve. I'm not a measurement crazy guy anymore. I used to be, and I used to keep on buying better test equipment so we can measure deeper into it. But I find that using like an audio precision and using the FFT function on it shows me a lot of how an amplifier works, but not so much how it sounds. And I have to say honestly, working on how an amplifier sounds is like a kind of a magical thing. And the only way you can make something sound really good is to know what you want and experiment.
Right. First, you have to know what you want it to be to make something good.
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. It's not easy to build something and then say, oh, I'm not sure I like it, and now and how can I make it sound? What do I have to change? Right. But I had a lot of learning experience with that when I designed the Momentum, and it's been.
And how long did it take to just do that first one? The first one.
A year. Yeah. Took me a year. First of all, it took me a year to figure out how to use a computer operated software to lay out a circuit board. That took me a long time. I used to lay it out with tape, and then I hired guys that worked for me that laid it out with computers. But I never personally learned how to lay it out with a computer. I'm just a tape guy with a big piece of Lexan, doing it 4-to-1 on a big board.
But now you're
now I use a computer, but that took me a while to figure out how to do. But most of the circuitry time was very exciting because I tried a bunch of different things I always wanted to try. A lot of them didn't work, and some of them did. But they were all based in sound.
So what about parts, like capacitors and resistors and how they sound?
Yeah, I did a lot of experiment with that back at Krell, and I did a lot more of it recently, and still are doing some experiments with it. But I find, metal film resistors, really good ones, and sometimes wire wounds have an extraordinarily good sound. And I predominantly use them. As far as caps go, I don't have any capacitors in my circuits that are in the audio pad, so I try to avoid that. I'm not a big fan of that sound because it always seems to have a sound.
What about transistors? Output transistors?
Output transistors, I've not been able to hear the difference with except the ones that are extraordinarily fast.
Okay.
The fast ones always sound better for whatever reason, and probably that's because they don't have so much latent distortion in them themselves trying to operate at some speeds. But the faster ones will sound better with the right circuit.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I think we've done it.
All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Dan. Great to see you.
Thank you.
This is Dan D'Agostino from...
Dan D'Agostino, Master Audio Systems.
All right. Thanks again, Dan.
Thank you, Steve.